Spirito recto sapere et de eius semper consolata negodere per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Sede sapientiae.
Ora pro nobis.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. All right, we're on page 20 of the notes. So it was mentioned that the divine gift of miracles belonged to the Catholic Church in the 11th century, as truly as it does in the present. In fact, you expect to see more miracles mentioned of those times than any possible ones today. And remember that a miracle is not something that just anybody can declare to have happened. The Church has to carry out an investigation of those things. That's something you see in the De Relatione course, if you haven't already, is everything that goes into determining a true miracle, separating it from a prodigy, which can even be worked by the power of the devil. And also, when it comes to canonizations, the kind of cures that are accepted as miracles, in canonization cases, there's a whole long list of criteria to determine what exactly is a miracle. The point being that the Church carries out thorough investigation of all the facts. It has to spend time gathering the facts and investigating them very closely in order to determine whether or not there's a true miracle here. And so nowadays, anybody sees something, thinks it's a true miracle, that's something that has to be treated with great care, because of course that still is possible, but it's just unlikely. It's unlikely because we do know that miracles, true miracles in the times moving towards the end of the world, and some of the signs of the approaching end of the world have already come to pass, that moving we do know that in the times towards the end of the world, during the time of the Antichrist, that there will be no true miracles, lest the faithful be deceived into thinking that the prodigies that will be worked by the Antichrist, perhaps himself and his minions, will be true miracles. There won't be any true miracles going on. Everybody will know that this isn't the real thing. So it seems highly unlikely today that there be any true miracles. It's not impossible, but one way or the other is something that can only be pronounced upon by the authority of the Church. Not just anybody can decide that there's a miracle. And just to be clear, that's not unheard of that someone has, let's say, certain odd theological ideas, and then becomes convinced that that a Eucharistic miracle happened very close to him, and therefore everything he says is true. And using that to try to tell people, you have to follow my position. Yeah, that's not an unheard of phenomenon. Just to be clear, that is a real thing that happened. So, it's only something that the authority of the Church can pronounce upon. What is a true miracle? And also, one of the criteria for determining a true miracle is that it could, if anything ever seems to be, well, for distinguishing a false one from a true one, more specifically, is that if ever a miracle seems to be worked in favor of error, it could not possibly be a true miracle. Because obviously the power of the miracle can only be worked by the power of God. And whenever God would only, of course, could only possibly ever use his power to confirm the truth of something. Remember, prophecies and miracles are the strongest motives of credibility for proving the truth of the faith. Things that can only be worked by the power of God. True prophecies and true miracles, only by the power of God. And those could, of course, God, being subsistent truth, could never possibly, and be infinitely good, could never possibly ever affirm anything other than what is true. And by exercising his power through prophecies and miracles, he does affirm what is true. Points out to it, makes it very clear to people that this is true. What this person is saying, this person says that I'm saying this, and now to prove the truth of it, this miracle is being worked. So this person is what I'm saying. I say this, and then this person rises from the dead to confirm the truth of that. And that person rises from the dead. You think immediately, okay, this person is right. So, of course, God could never do something like that to prove the truth, supposedly, the truth of something false. It's impossible. Because sometimes people do try to do that. They try to point to supposed miracles proving the truth of that Novus Ordo religion is still essentially, substantially the Catholic faith. And nothing could ever prove that, because that's false. Obviously, we already know that that's false. So no, there could not possibly be a true miracle confirming that. I'd say there could be no true miracles today, ever, of course, but no miracle that could ever possibly be worked would ever prove that. If any supposed miracle would seem to confirm the truth that the Novus Ordo religion is still substantially the Catholic faith, then that's not a true miracle. Any prodigious event that might seem to point to that notion could not possibly be a true miracle, because that's affirming a falsehood, trying to lend credibility to a falsehood. We already have that proven. There's no question that is a falsehood. So, and then people do that sometimes. It does come up. So be aware of all that. So this seems to have been the authoritative church seems to have pronounced that this is a true miracle, the one we looked at last time. The whole population of Florence, in fact, city of Florence in Italy, witnessed this public manifest and splendid miracle. We talked about that already, about the fact that it was really it was a trial by fire that this particular Saint Peter Ignatius, the fiery one, was put through, and that was really a superstitious practice. The trial by fire is a superstitious practice in itself. That is, in fact, a form of tempting God, calling upon him to intervene in a way he does not usually intervene. And that is to tempt God. But still, God still saw fit in his infinite wisdom to work a true miracle on that occasion. So, we already talked about all that. So the Emperor of Germany, Henry IV, the unworthy and ungrateful ward of the Holy See, though but 18 years of age, already showed a most unbridled wickedness. His shameless licentiousness respected neither virginal purity nor conjugal fidelity. So our author's not going into too much detail here and explaining exactly what he did, but he behaved in a way that's, let's say, is terrible as it is. Obviously, it's horrible, it's disgusting, and gravely sinful. Still, it's something you hardly find surprising when it comes to royalty, any royalty ever, really, in the civil order at least. Just not surprising. Common, it's terrible, and everything, but you're hardly surprised to hear about it. Again, contrast that to the fact that whenever you notice that a pope is a saint, you come across the name of a pope who is canonized, you think, oh, of course, yes, one of the many. And how few accusations there are, even with any plausibility whatsoever. In some cases, sure, there might be true, but the fact that everybody knows the names of the popes who are accused, typically, those seem to be fairly well known. Everybody knows the names, at least some of them, of the popes who are accused of living poor personal lives. It just goes to show how rare that is. That sanctity is something you find very commonly in the lives of popes. As being pope does not grant them personal impeccability. It's not an absolute guarantee of sanctity, but it does give them the graces of state to have the sanctity that they ought to have in that state, certainly. And clearly many of them, and in fact we could easily say most of them, actually correspond to those graces. There are some instances of people who, at least I can think of one particular instance of Pope whose life before his election was anything from scandalous to not particularly edifying, but then after he became Pope, clearly was personally transformed. So that can happen too. The graces of state are a powerful thing. They truly are. Clearly, though, when it comes to civil rulers, you're hardly surprised when you hear about all kinds of disgusting behavior. To his heartless debauchery spared nothing that could feed his passions. He immolated the husbands whose bed he could not otherwise defile. So if he wanted to sin with a woman who was already married, he would perhaps kill the husband first. The same doom repaid the accomplice or confidant, seldom his equals in depravity, whose tone or gesture seemed to deprecate such excesses. First united to the Princess Bertha, daughter of Otto Margrave of Italy, who had brought him as a dowry the virtues and pure inclinations of a young girl of 15, Henry repudiated her after a year of marriage. So he's just personally thoroughly disgusting. This is Henry IV character. Not to be confused, this is Henry IV of Germany, of course, as we've been saying, not to be confused with Henry IV of France, who is also very prominent, but in a very different period of history. So this brutal act revolted the whole of Germany. The Archbishop of Mentz wrote to the Pope on the subject, seeking to have the affair judged by legates. So the whole question, affair, yes, can be used to mean, ongoing situations of adultery, but here it just means, includes, he seems to have been an adulterer, but Henry IV, that is, but here it just means the judge the whole situation. So Alexander II entrusted the mission to St. Peter Damian, who had just made a tour of all the French provinces to restore morality and discipline. So the appointment of a man whose austerity and apostolic vigor were known to the whole world was particularly disagreeable to Henry IV, yet he dared not slight the juridical examination of the legate of the Holy See. So such was the order of things in the Middle Ages that even someone as personally rotten as Henry IV couldn't just refuse to acknowledge the legate of the Holy See, refuse to undergo judgment by the Holy See. That's how strongly it was understood, how widely accepted was the correct order of things that existed in the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages were a time in which we could say that the order of things in Western Europe was essentially perfect. The system was all correct. Obviously, there are still problems like this. For as long as you have human beings afflicted with who have fallen human nature afflicted with the effects of original sin, you're going to have problems. That's just going to happen. On Earth, there will always be problems. You have people involved, then there are going to be difficulties. But the system was essentially correct. And it took a long time for it to come about. It wasn't built overnight by any means. But it was, for the Middle Ages, we can say that was, the order of things was, in fact, ordered. So St. Peter Damian, after making strict inquiries into the matter, declared to the king that his course was unworthy not only of a prince, but of a Christian. So not only has your behavior been completely disgusting for someone in a high position, but just completely revolting to anybody with any sense of morality whatsoever. Especially for someone claiming to be a Catholic. I mean, you can still have the faith. It is possible to sin heinously in various ways and still have the faith. There are sins. To sin against the virtue of faith is to lose the virtue of faith, but it's possible to retain the supernatural virtue of faith, but that it be dead, what we call dead faith. That's what it's commonly called, which is to say, once infused, at the very least, at baptism, with all the other infused virtues, supernatural faith, but dead in the sense of no longer being informed by the life of grace. And definitely, any grave sin causes the loss of the virtue of charity in the soul, but not necessarily of the other virtues. Sin against that virtue causes the loss of that virtue, supernatural virtue, but the others potentially remain. They can, as long as that person has committed any of the grave sins against those other virtues. Somebody can sin against holy chastity, as Henry IV is doing, but still not sin against the virtue of faith, and so retain it. That is possible. Now, one sin leads to another. Very often it happens that somebody who is in the habit of committing grave sins against the virtue of chastity does in fact proceed to the loss of the virtue of faith. For example, it seems Martin Luther, he proceeded from one to the other to making excuses for his lack of ability to control himself. And then after that, started inventing heresies to try to just explain away why his situation wasn't so bad after all. Commonly that happens. And sometimes it happens, you hear people coming, who seem to be thinking correctly, being objective about something for a while, and then all of a sudden they change their minds on it for no reason. You hear the reasons they give. You should know better than to think that this is an argument against what you've held. You think, okay, what is the motive for this? What does this person want to do that his objective acknowledgement of the truth that he previously held would tell him he can't do that? And sooner or later it becomes clear what that person wanted to do. Okay, well, no wonder he wanted to change his mind on that, because he couldn't do what he's doing now, or to still hold what he held before, which was true. That happens. It's not an uncommon phenomenon. both in the practice and also in the theoretical order. Many times people start with a predetermined idea and work backwards to try to justify it, squeeze things, force things into a particular conclusion. Very common. All right, so if you despise the authority of the holy canons, said the legate, St. Peter Damian, have at least some regard for your reputation. So it's personal reputation. Just think of that, at least. Go down in history as being someone who's completely disgusting, as clearly he has. If you keep on like this. If you resist this advice dictated by reason and faith, the sovereign pontiff will find himself condemned to use the thunders of the church against you and will never consent to crown you emperor. No, he's technically not even emperor. He's king of Germany. That's his title, really. He's a king. But he is really emperor-elect in the sense of not having been crowned. As the Pope is supposed to, or at least the legate of the Pope is supposed to crown the emperor. Somebody deputed by him. So Henry dared not persist and yielded with the expression that he would bear the burden which he could not throw off. Now keep in mind, somebody who behaves like this risks excommunication. The authority of the church can excommunicate anybody for any sufficiently grave offense, for being sufficiently scandalous in any way. And certainly behaving the way Henry IV is behaving that's ample reason to excommunicate somebody who is supposed to be a prominent Catholic monarch, one of the highest ranking in the world. And behaving like this, could get excommunicated. In fact, Henry IV would later on be excommunicated for other reasons, but not for any sins against the, it's not directly against the faith, but for questions of lay investiture, which we've already mentioned before, but we'll see that later. So still his morality and general conduct remained unchanged. St. Arno, Archbishop of Cologne, quitted the court where crowned scandal reigned. So scandal in the person of the crowned person of Henry IV, and ceased to offer his counsels to a prince who would hear none but those of passion. The Empress Agnes, foreseeing that her son would prove the plague of the world, retired into Italy, where she placed herself under the direction of St. Peter Damian, and ended in retirement and the performance of good works, a life begun amid the intrigues and disorders of a court. So, intrigues and disorders of a court that's an expression you find all over the place, in one form or another, because it's very common. Royal courts are very often filled with such things. All kinds of plotting and backstabbing, vying for position, jockeying for positions of influence and authority, and disorders of every kind, all kinds of sins of every variety. Many different varieties, anyway. Very common. Something you expect to hear about. In a civil court. Once again, in a civil court. So St. Peter Damian, after his legation in Germany, once more entreated the sovereign pontiff to release him from the eminent post he held in the church, that he might end his days in the solitude of custody, silence, and prayer. Hildebrand, the Archdeacon Hildebrand, who commanded the confidence of Pope Alexander II, as he had done with that of his predecessors, always opposed the wish of his friend. So this is, I see it time and again in the lives of the saints, where the saint wants to do one thing, but the will of God is clearly something else. The saint always ends up, of course, conforming to the will of God, which is one of the reasons why they get canonized, ultimately. But still, it proves very difficult for them. So he thus wrote to Hildebrand on the subject, "In all your struggles and all your triumphs, I have ever plunged into the thickest of the fray. To serve you, I have borrowed the rapidity of the lightning's flash. Your name has never passed my lips unaccompanied by blessings and praise, and God alone can fathom my love for you. But now I would hasten to recollect myself at the close of my career and to give to the service of God the last hours of my life." But this generous athlete of Christ was denied the rest he so ardently desired, as very often happens. So in this case, though, you have one saint, St. Peter Damian. Later, Hildebrand would become Pope Gregory VII, later St. Gregory VII. So you have one saint entreating another, and the other is saying no. That is, for the future, Gregory VII, clearly a good judge of character, recognize the talents of St. Peter Damian as the authority. The authority of the church wants you to do this, and Pope Pius II wants you to continue doing what you're doing. And clearly himself recognized that the church needs the services of somebody as talented as that. So I'll be right back and get a few more pages of notes here. So page 21 that you have here is handout. The one you currently have. The one you currently have is a duplicate of page 20. Two copies. Am I missing anybody's name? No. So just printed an extra copy. All right, so page 21, the actual page 21. He died, St. Peter Damian died while fulfilling a mission on which he had been sent by the Pope to the Archbishop of Ravenna. So the works of St. Peter Damian have been collected into 4 volumes and are worthy of attention from the variety of subjects treated, number of valuable observations on dogma, moral, clerical, and monastic discipline, and on the history of the Church. All right, so our author goes on, saying a few more words in praise of St. Peter Damian. So we'll move on past. I can read the rest of it. It's good, definitely. I mean, what he says is true. But it's essentially just to say that he was a saint who wrote in a conspicuously excellent manner. And indeed, that is the case. All right, so England, notice we're looking at the fact that St. Peter Damian died in 1072. England had a few years before that witnessed an event which was to prove, this is a bit of an understatement, most fruitful and great results. In other words, of tremendous impact down the centuries to follow. So on the death of Edward the Confessor, the throned King of England, the throne was disputed by 2 powerful rivals, representatives of the 2 hostile races, Saxon and Norman. So Harold the Saxon based his claims upon nearer kindred to the family of the last monarch. William, Duke of Normandy, alleged the testament by which Edward bequeathed the crown to him. So here we're talking about Saxons, who are actually a German tribe. And you'll find other mentions of Saxons in mainland continental Europe, and they're Germans living in Germany. So these are the Anglo-Saxons. In other words, Germans, a German tribe, Saxons, who ended up taking over England at some point, and who ended up ruling over it. But they were the Saxons who were living in England, hence the Anglo-Saxons. Or they merged with, and England itself is named for the Angles, the tribe of the Angles, a different tribe from the ancient Britons who were living in Britain when Julius Caesar conquered it, who were closely related to the ancient Gauls. But these were Anglo-Saxons. They went to, so the Angles took over Britain, so it became known as Angleland or England, and then the Saxons came in and merged with them and forming the Anglo-Saxons, who ruled England for a while. And now we have the Normans, who are their own entity. Normandy is a region of France to this day. But the Normans at this time, you might call people who live in Normandy today Normans in some sense, but the Normans of this time were really, in effect, their own nation. And they were just given a special setup with the King of France to be a duchy within the nation of France. I mean, they became French in many ways. They spoke French, they adopted French customs and so forth, but they really had their own agenda. And they were effectively independent. At this time, the kings of France were relatively quite weak. And people like the Duke of Normandy, it was with them that the real power lay. So William the Conqueror is indeed a Duke of Normandy. So the ruler of technically a part of the Kingdom of France, a vassal of the King of France, now eyeing the throne of a completely different nation. That's the situation we have here. So clearly he had the military power, obviously. It's very famous that he actually conquered England. So clearly he had the military power actually to do that, actually to conquer this other nation. So Saxony is still a region of Germany to this day, or at least whether it's still, how much of that is still within modern day Germany is another thing. But by the time of the map on the wall there was still a king of Saxony in Germany. Actually, there's even a picture. Because in the German Empire, which we have listed there, the Second Reich, as it was called, it was the king of Prussia was the emperor of all of Germany. So it's the king of Prussia and the emperor of Germany, and there were still other monarchs within Germany. It was still an empire is really a patchwork of nations. So the Austrian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian empires that you see listed there, or illustrated there, was a collection of many different ethnicities, many different ones. Now, to the point that I think I mentioned it before, sometimes in their army, they would end up giving their orders in English because that was the only language that everybody could understand sufficiently. There were so many different ones. There were instances of that. So that's the kind of thing that an empire is, typically. That you see a nation the size of the United States that's truly an empire. I mean, of imperial proportions, in fact, of vast imperial proportions. Just the country itself. It's not even considering any overseas territories or anything like that. Just the nation itself is of truly vast imperial proportions. And to have an empire in that sense, it is an empire. Nothing really ever changes. It most definitely is an empire in many senses. Not in the sense of having an autocratic emperor, perhaps, but definitely in the sense of having the size and power of an empire, no question whatsoever there. That it's relatively unusual that you have such a huge empire that has as little cultural differences, or as few cultural differences amongst its members as you have in the United States. That's relatively rare that you would ever have that. Yeah, there are definitely differences from one place to the next, and there are definitely, at this point, deep cultural divisions, but that things could ever have worked as well as they ever might have, and to whatever extent they still do work, in such a large place with mainly one language, uniting everybody, and cultural differences, whatever they are, being less than you would expect, or certainly less across the same territory, same space in Europe. That's for sure. That is an unusual thing. Most empires are composed of nations with many different, in some cases, significantly different cultures. And so, at the time of the German Empire, we're talking about early 20th century, there were still different nations, different German nations within the German Empire. So there was still a king of Saxony. So there's actually a photograph of the Kaiser talking to the king of Saxony. And I still have that title, King of Saxony. So these are the Anglo-Saxons we're talking about here. So William sought to obtain the support of the sovereign pontiff, and thus wrote to Alexander II, "Should God grant me success, it will be my glory to hold the English scepter directly from him and from St. Peter, his vicar." So many times you see English, like, keep in mind this is a French author from whom we're taking all of this ultimately. It's been translated, but ultimately this is a French author we're looking at. He's going to be in favor of the French in the situation, or the Normans in this case. But I mean, there's no reason to question his presentation of the facts here, that William the Conqueror probably said that, and then the Pope decided in favor of William, and taking into account all of these technicalities, who is technically the one who is right here, he decided in favor of William, and as a mark of his sympathy, sent him a standard blessed by his own hand. This is Pope Alexander II again. So, the Duke of Normandy, so this is really, again, the Duke of Normandy proclaiming a war to go and conquer England. It's not the nation of France as a whole, just the Duke of Normandy. And what's happening within his territories. And we'll clearly see William the Conqueror, once he conquered England, did not rule it for the King of France. It was not, England itself was not in any sense incorporated into France, into whatever empire France had at the time. And France was itself a sizable nation, but they ended up having in later centuries a vast overseas empire. But definitely England was never ever considered a part of that. So if that sounds like an awkward situation that resulted from this, then yes, most definitely. So William the Conqueror published a proclamation of war in his own states and throughout the neighboring provinces, promising liberal pay, so generous pay, and plunder of England to every man of tall stature and able body who should enlist in his service. He soon found himself at the head of an army of 60,000 men, among whom were 104 knights. Keep in mind, knights were noblemen. And the armor that knights wore was, well, not, for one thing, I'm not an expert on this, but the people who are say that armor was not nearly as heavy as people tend to think it was. People tend to think it weighed a ton. Not really. It was surprisingly effective, more effective than you might think, for keeping whoever wore it safe. But it was not very heavy, not nearly as heavy as you'd think. I mean, obviously, it can only be so heavy if people manage to wear it while riding horses. And horses can only carry so much. Horses are very strong, of course, but they're not limitless in what they can bear. And so they had to not just carry a person wearing armor, but also be able to gallop into battle, potentially, carrying someone wearing armor. So it couldn't have been that heavy. I mean, just on immediate consideration when you really start to think about it. But the armor was quite expensive, that's for sure. It was skilled labor to forge a suit of armor. So 104 knights, that's a lot of knights, so those are noblemen, as opposed to the regular men-at-arms. And 60,000, that's, of course, a substantial force. There have been much larger armies in history, but that's a large force. And that's a typical force of what you would find, say, during the American Civil War. Armies, 60, 70, 80,000 men, of those numbers. In that in the 19th century, when the scale of war was going up. So the noblest houses in France were represented in this brilliant expedition. Yeah, perhaps, though, once again, the King of France, notice there's no mention of any King of France being involved in this at all, because he's maybe looking upon it with approval, perhaps, but whatever he was doing was not much more beyond that. So on the 29th of September of 1066 AD, William set out from the mouth of the Somme River in France, which there would later be more than one, but one very famous battle fought there in 1916, the Battle of the Somme in World War I. The worst day in British military history. We're talking about William the Conqueror again having an army of 60,000 men. The British lost 60,000 men that day. Not all killed, but suffered 60,000 casualties on one day. Now, the worst day ever in which the British military ever suffered. Now, in World War I, we're talking about armies of millions of men, but even so, that's still a huge number to lose all at once. So that was the Battle of the Somme, which is also, incidentally, the first battle in which tanks made an appearance, which is actually a code word for the new weapon being developed. It didn't work very well. The tanks didn't do much during World War I. They were there, definitely, but their effect was much less than they would be later on. Anyway, William set out from the mouth of the Somme River with a numerous fleet and landed ere, meaning before, the close of the same day on the coast of Sussex. Sir Harold awaited him there on the field of Hastings, very famously the Battle of Hastings, 1066. So William proposed to him, offered to him, either to abdicate in his favor, or to refer the question to the arbitration of the Pope, or to settle the dispute by a single combat. You keep in mind here that there were multiple claimants. These were not the only claimants, at least, well, at this point they were. But there was another claimant to the throne of England, which was another Harold, Hardrada his name was king of Norway, and he had some claim, I don't know what it was, I don't know on what grounds. We saw what the claims of Harold and William were to the throne of England. I'm not sure what claims he had. But he actually also invaded England prior to the Battle of Hastings. And Harold II had been set up waiting for William's invasion, had to go off and fight a battle, which actually defeated that invasion from those Vikings who were coming in from the north. Stamford Bridge is another famous battle, Battle of Stamford Bridge. He won that battle, actually killed Harold Hardrada in the battle, and then went back south to fight off William, and then didn't win that battle, of course. So all these alternatives were rejected. And also, yes, the single combat thing was a widely recognized way of settling a question. Instead of having a huge, expensive battle, keep in mind, wars cost a lot of money, and it's just pure expenditure. Well, at least if you lose, it's definitely pure expenditure. But even if you win, you could still lose in a sense by just having to spend so much of your nation's resources that you become damaged. So that's what happened. We're talking about World War I. In many senses, I guess England and France technically were on the winning side of World War I. In many ways, they lost. Many ways. France was effectively defeated. At a certain point, their military became essentially inoperable. They got eventually there was a widespread mutiny in the French army. They didn't rise up and try to fight their superiors. They just refused to fight. Essentially, the whole French army went on strike. French love to go on strike. And essentially the whole army went on strike. They said, we're not fighting anymore. We're sick of running into German machine gun fire and getting mowed down in tens of thousands. We're sick of that. Not doing it anymore. So that was brought under control by one Marshal Pétain, a very famous name. But still, effectively, they were done. I mean, something like that happens, you're never getting morale back up again, especially not among the French. But yes, the French were effectively defeated, and the British, yes, they fought to the end. That they didn't suffer that kind of problem, but they suffered heavily, very heavily. And to the point that they had decades later, when World War II started, they had no stomach for that. They really didn't want another round of that kind of thing. So you could still win by lose, because wars are very expensive. So the single combat thing was one way, of course, of preventing huge amounts of suffering and death, potentially, as well as avoiding the enormous expenditure of war, of a big battle. The idea being that either the leaders of each army, or at least some representatives sent by each one, fight a miniature battle, as it were. And whichever side prevails in that is the one that wins the battle. Ultimately, though, you'd still have to honor that agreement. Both sides would still have to honor the agreement, and the losing side would still have to voluntarily withdraw. If they were to refuse, it might result in a battle anyway. But this is different from a duel. In some sense, it is a duel. Of course, if you have two contestants fighting each other with deadly weapons, that is in some sense a duel. But the sense in which duels are condemned by the Church is one in which the two combatants are engaging in this for questions on private authority, not in public authority, as in the case of a war, but by their own private authority, whatever sense they have authority, for some reason of honor, typically something stupid, or potentially something stupid. So this is a different situation from what is typically called a duel. But in any case, all these alternatives were all rejected, and both parties prepared for battle. So on the evening of the, so this is, I've seen this claim denied, but in any case, that is in itself a denial of a claim is also to recognize that it is the commonly repeated, and this is what is commonly repeated. Whether it's true or not is another thing. You have to investigate that. But on the eve of the contest, the Normans are said to have spent the night in prayer, and the Saxons feasted and filled the air with their national songs. I couldn't tell you whether or not that actually true, but apparently commonly enough said. So it should be Bishop of Bayeux there. In the morning, the Bishop of Bayeux, William's brother, Bayeux, offered up the holy sacrifice and blessed the troops. That's something that you see throughout history. Actually, in fact, in Gettysburg, there's a large statue of an Irish Catholic priest giving, I think it was general absolution during the battle. There's a statue, I think on the very rock on which he stood to give at least a blessing or general absolution. I think it's a general absolution, but the rock on which he stood to do that, there's a huge statue of him there. So go to Gettysburg, which is not far from here. You can see that. So, the Duke of Normandy wore precious relics suspended around his neck and kept the Pope's standard close beside him. This is how our author frames it as a Catholic army preparing to win the soil of England. Yes, that is true, but it wasn't a war really fought for religious motives. It was one question of who had the claim to the throne. So I mean that doesn't mean that it's unimportant. Question of who is right is unimportant or anything like that, but it just means that it was not a war whose motive was religion. So both Saxons and Normans performed prodigies of valor. At length Harold fell, and his army was routed and fled. So the Battle of Hastings gave the throne to William of Normandy. Also, incidentally, the stone from which the Sisters' convent chapel in Brookshill is built is made from stone from which William the Conqueror, from stone from the same quarry from which William the Conqueror took stone, nearly 1,000 years ago now. But somebody just gave that to them. When we say people just give the nuns things, we really mean that. They really just get all kinds of things donated to them, including stone from ancient quarries. Which is great. I mean, it's a good thing they get that. It's just, there is some, many times it's said jokingly that they get everything, but there is a basis of truth to that for sure. They get a lot of things just donated to them. It's just a fact. That's a good thing. It's not to hold it against them. It's very good that they have. That's a beautiful chapel that they have there. But they just had to give it to them from that quarry. So on the very hill where old England had fallen with the last Saxon king, William raised a rich and splendid abbey called the Abbey of the Battle de Bello in fulfillment of a vow to St. Martin, patron of the troops of Gaul. So the names of the conquerors were engraved upon tablets in the monastery, where they were still legible at a very recent date, and this book was written in the 19th century. Remember, so how recently now is another question. But this was the Golden Book of the English nobility. All right, so okay, after this, yes, you'd see, obviously, the Saxons were Germanic, perhaps having undergone some changes in their perhaps way of life or their customs, their language due to having lived in England, but that they were Germanic. At the basis of it, they were a Germanic tribe, and their language was Germanic. And that's, of course, where we get the fact that English, to this day, is at its base a Germanic language. There are many differences between English and German, but it's easy for Germans to learn English because they realize that when they start studying it, that this is like German but easier. So for an English speaker studying German, that's more difficult because it's an upgrade, even if the basis is similar. So it's an English. English is a Germanic language at its base, as opposed to a Romance language, which is to say a language that is derived from Latin. But even so, a great deal of English vocabulary comes from Latin, a huge amount of it, in fact. And much of that is through French, vocabulary introduced through the Normans, who, of course, were Frenchmen in many ways. Different from the rest of France, but still in many ways Frenchmen. And so that's also why we have so many words, and multiple different words for the same thing in English. And you can see how the hierarchy worked in England after the Norman Conquest, the hierarchy of society, based on which words are used for which form of the thing. So when the animal is in the field, it's a cow. The Germanic, derived from a Germanic root, where the Saxon peasants, the German-speaking Saxon peasants, took care of it. But by the time it gets to the table, it's beef, from the French boeuf, where the French-speaking Norman nobles ate it. Just a little example, but you can see the traces of that to this day. So you're going to talk about a beef walking in the fields or eating cow at a table. You just don't say that. That's not the correct use of each of those words. That's how firmly that became fixed due to those which level of society was speaking which language, but as was all merging to form modern day English. Modern day English was a long way from actually coming into existence at this point. If you look at Middle English, that's difficult to understand. It's more or less recognizable as English, but if you read Old English, forget it. That's like a completely different language. You pick up an Old English text today, you would not understand a word of it, without undergoing special studies to be able to read it. That's Old English. So, the story of how any modern day language came to be is never a simple, easy story. It can be drawn along broad lines, but it's never a simple or easy story. I mean, these languages undergo changes and fusions of influence and vocabulary. All kinds of things happen to influence the way that they're formed over many centuries. So it's never a quick or easy answer. How did this or that language come to be the way it is? Where did this or that word come from? Even sometimes is a little bit mysterious. But it's an interesting thing to study, more interesting than you might think, to study how languages come to be. For example, the short version of how did French come to be pronounced the way it is that, well, it seems that the Romans imposed Latin upon the Gauls whom they conquered, but who tended to still pronounce it with the pronunciation of whatever languages they had before. And so that gave rise to French pronunciation. Again, gave rise. It's part of what helped to bring it about. Anyway. While gradually introducing into his newly conquered realm the more polished manners of France, William solemnly confirmed the ancient laws of the land. So all this, of course, we're talking about here, not strictly speaking church history, but also, as we've been seeing, nothing ever happens in isolation. And this, of course, is of interest to the church, great interest to the church, in fact, that all this happened the way it did. And this is, as our author pointed out, a tremendous impact on history down the centuries, into nearly the full millennium since then. In the grand scheme of things, nearly a full millennium since then. It's definitely had huge effects down the centuries. So those which related to the Church in England were comprised in 22 articles drawn up in the Latin tongue. They secured the right of pious pilgrimages, and the safety of travelers, and confirmed the payment of the Romescot, a kind of tax, a part of which went to the support of the church and school of the English in Rome. So this is something that you see also frequently mentioned is perhaps it probably existed in a very different form at the time that we're looking at as opposed to later on, but there were different colleges of different nations in Rome. So they would send the different seminarians who had showed great promise would be sent to Rome to study at their college of their nation there. For example, Archbishop Lefebvre went to study at the French college in Rome. In fact, you can stay to this day. You could stay at a hotel right across the street from where he studied there. I stayed there once. His Excellency told me about that. And Archbishop Lefebvre studied right across the street from there. And they had, of course, they had many different people sent from different parts of the world there. They all had their national uniform, so to speak. They had something, they all wore the cassock, but they had something about it was unique. They had maybe some kind of colored sash or something to to mark them apart as being from whatever country they were from, which is also interesting. All right, so we'll continue on with this later. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen, subtuum presidium confugimus, Sancta Dei Genitrix nostras supplicationes et specias in necessitatibus et a periculis conjunctis, libera nos semper vigoriosa et benedicta. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen.